I have the great pleasure this evening of introducing a brother philosopher, a fellow African-American philosopher of liberation. I guess we kind of call ourselves to some extent Africana philosophers of existence, and we can go on and other things we can call ourselves. But brother philosopher I've known for about 20 years, Dr. Lewis Gordon. Among Lewis Gordon's books, since he's talking of Fanon, I'll just give you a sample. One is called Fanon, a Critical Reader. Another is called Fanon and the Crisis of European Man. And now, currently, the text with which he will now discuss with you and the themes thereof is What Fanon Said, a philosophical introduction to his life and his thought. A superlative work also, as eloquent as it is insightful. At this point, I will introduce our friend, I'll present my friend here, Dr. Lewis Gordon.
Thank you, Robert. Some of you have seen me in various contexts speak, and as I was asked by the wonderful gentleman over there, are you going to speak with your shoes on? And the answer is no. I don't speak with my shoes on. And some people, I sometimes reflect on it. Why do you do that, some people would ask. Well, you know, if you're going to speak truth, you might as well establish a sacred space. And then there's some people, as you hear, I was born in Jamaica, they say, you know, you could take the man out of the island, but not the island out of the man. And then there's some who just say, you know, makes him comfortable. Now, of course, all three can be true. So I begin with Shalom, Salam Alaikum, Amjambo. I was in Kenya recently. And of course, as they say in the islands, how you keeping? And I hope you're all keeping fine. Fanon would have been 90 this year. And one of the things I should bring up first is, I've written a lot of books, but I don't normally do book sessions. I just write my books and keep going. But Fanon would have been 90, and so I decided to celebrate his 90th for a variety of reasons. And one of them is, as I speak tonight, many of these reasons will become clear. I kicked off the year, for instance, in Nairobi, Kenya, because Fanon's buried on the African continent. And so I made sure my first talk on Fanon for this year was on the continent. But of course, although he's buried on the continent, you know where Fanon is. It's wherever the struggle is. So he's here. He's in Ferguson. He's across this country. He's in the Sudan. He's in the Congo. He's wherever it is. Now in April, I was speaking at Brooklyn Commons. And when I was speaking at the Brooklyn Commons, one of the things that was striking was that a lot of people were also in the streets of New York that night blocking off the city. And you know what their rallying cry was? Solidarity with Baltimore. So you could see the subtext here, what Baltimore did. But in addition to that, when one begins to think about these issues, when I spoke in Kenya, I began with why I'm wearing this t-shirt. And this t-shirt, of late, you know, there's a certain point, I just give talks in t-shirts. And I choose a t-shirt that gives the message of the talk. So I think this t-shirt's message speaks for itself. Solidarity with New York, solidarity with Baltimore, I can't breathe. Now when you think about this thing, I can't breathe, if you look at Pendua Mes Blanc, black skin, white mass, Fanon said, why are there people fighting in Vietnam? And he said, it's because they cannot breathe. When you look at year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, what did Fanon say? Fanon said that the revolution is the oxygen to give birth to the new humanity. If you look all around the world right now, and it's wild, right? People talk about Black Lives Matter. You know what got me with Black Lives Matter? Did you all see the protest in, I'm not kidding, Syria? Think about it. People in Syria in a civil war, and they took time out to march in the streets with signs that said, Black Lives Matter. And you may wonder, what's going on? Well, as I speak, one of the things you'll begin to see about Fanon is that Fanon connects to issues that deal with how we're all interconnected. So for instance, we were reflecting at the table a few minutes ago about how crazy it is right now that the police come out with tanks and all these weapons, and we're looking at this circumstances going around, and one of the things you could immediately reflect on is a very simple point. People don't win wars anymore. And in an environment in which people are not winning wars, but there's a profound economic investment in something called a military-industrial complex, a new kind of war has emerged. And it's called the war against the people, the war against citizenry. And one of the things you know when those kind of things happen, because when you want to wonder what black is, well, you know what black is. Black is called the front lines. And so if you're wondering what's going on here, and I would connect around the world, you have to understand what it is to be at the front lines at a war against the people. Now, we're getting together, we'll talk about Fanon. And you may wonder why I write a book called What Fanon Said. Well, it puts me in a rather Fanonian situation, because you see, recently there are a lot of very, very bad books about Fanon. And you may say, wow, he's going to go out there and say there's some really bad books about Fanon. And what do I mean by a bad book about Fanon? Well, there are books written about Fanon, for instance. First of all, there are books explicitly with the project of de-intellectualizing Fanon. And this is connected to what you could call a form of epistemic racism, because the idea is that black people don't offer thought. So if you have a black intellectual, surely they cannot be interested in his thought. And if you think about it, nobody's going to write a book about Kant, Marx, Hegel, and don't talk about their thought. If you think about a European intellectual, the life and thought are one. But there's a tendency to want to disaggregate black intellectuals and to treat us as if all we are is interesting biography. Now, this is not to say Fanon's biography isn't interesting. I'm going to say some things about it because not everybody here may know about his life, and I have to make it very, very short because I want to get to the ideas. But in addition to that, one of the things one has to take very seriously in this de-intellectualizing project is its ongoing tendency. For instance, I had written a book called An Introduction to Africana, that's African Diasporic Philosophy. And one of the reasons I ended up writing that book was because I was sent that book, a version of a book like that, to referee. And the author, the person who sent the proposal, was just a hodgepodge of stuff about black philosophers and just patch them up together. And my response was that was an intellectual. If what black people offer are ideas, then it's irrelevant the actual racial background of the person who comes to those ideas. And so I began to argue that these ideas, there are three ideas, and I'd like you to keep that in mind as I speak, that really inform what we could call Afro-modern thought. The first one is pretty obvious. One of the things you know, for instance, about black people is black people have been told in the Euro-modern world that we're not really people, that we're either property, we're subhuman, we're animals, we're not people. So the question you have to ask first is, what is it to be a person, to be a human being, to be people? The second one is pretty obvious. You can't talk about black people and don't talk about freedom. And in fact, one of the things you all know in the United States of America is that this is a country in which people talk a lot about freedom, while developing techniques of eradicating it. So in a way, if you're going to talk about these ideas, you're also talking about the struggle for freedom. But then there's a third thing to think about. And the third thing to think about connects when we think back to the first two. Because if you're going to ask what it is to be a human being, some people get into a certain kind of face-off. So some people say, you know, if you're going to talk about what it is to be a human being, you're going to talk about identity. You're going to talk about who or what you are. And some people say, I don't want that identity stuff. I want to talk about liberation, freedom. But the problem is, of course, the question of freedom becomes, if you're going to be free, free to become what? And what are you if it's not connected to what you're doing? So as you begin to address those issues, the connection comes in, and you deal with this other issue. And it's called, how do you justify your thought? Now, many of you know if somebody comes up and says to you, you're not a human being, the first thing you're going to say is, what do you mean I'm not a human being? I'm just as human as you are. But if you were to say that, you would have committed a profound mistake. Because you would have made the person who challenged your humanity the standard of humanity. But what if the person who challenged your humanity is a very low standard? What are we doing if we make people who use racism, sexism, homophobia, class deprecation, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamicism, down all of the antis, if we make that person the standard, then we're going to be in deep trouble. So suppose you make yourself the standard. Well, if you make yourself the standard, one of the issues you're going to face is what makes you the standard as well. And if you begin to interrogate standards, you begin to deal with ideas. So one of the first things you have to deal with is that ideas become central for any struggle for freedom. And this is where someone like Fanon comes in. Now, when you mention Fanon, one of the things about Fanon is, I mentioned in the book, he's an outlaw intellectual. He's what we call a badass. And we're talking about somebody who, and somebody who between the age of, was publishing between the age of 20, the publications between the age of 26 and the last one when he was 36. This Fanon we know all this about is from 10 years of writing. And when you really think about it, I know, makes some people feel bad, doesn't it? But then you get into more complicated issues when you think about someone like Fanon. Because you see, within that framework, there are people who also love to hate Fanon. You bring up Fanon, for instance, in my career, I write almost everything I wrote in the first 10 years of my career was something that people told me would ruin my career. And I was like saying, you know, I grew up in the Bronx. My father in his childhood was homeless, and we find ways to survive. I'm going to write what I want to write. And in the academy today, you know what they call people like me? Crazy. But the fact of the matter is this. It would be really weird to think of someone like Fanon writing for tenure. I mean, that's really weird. So already he makes people look bad. They would rather somebody who is more cowardly and looking for tenure like Heidegger. You know, and they valorize in the academy today as if people are revolution and so forth, the most cowardly intellectuals you could imagine. But you look at someone like Fanon, and you begin to say, so you realize there's a world that loves to hate Fanon. How much they love to hate Fanon, the kind of stuff I've heard over the years would boggle your mind. I remember I was giving a talk one place where a scholar, a very eminent scholar, looked at me and said, Fanon called Mayat Capacia a whore. And she did it so convincingly. Now, I'm the Fanon expert. For a second, I believed her. And then I was like, wait, he never said that. And then there are all these other kinds, you know. I mean, there are all of these things about, well, you know, you already know this. And I'm going to talk about it a lot because you'll hear it a lot, especially in the context of recent events in Baltimore. There's a way, the moment you say Fanon, people talk about violence. In fact, you can't even finish, you could say Fanon-violence. Right? Violence. And for them, that means you don't listen to Fanon. In other words, people use a lot of ways to avoid reading or listening or going through the work of Fanon. And then there's the other extreme. The other extreme is if you bring up Fanon, they start doing something that every black philosopher in this room or political scientist or black intellectual knows. Robert Burt knows this. Floyd Hayes knows this. We can go through it. The moment you bring up a black intellectual, what many people look for to make that intellectual, many women in this room know this, is you got to go find a white man. So you got to find a European thinker to say that black intellectual is simply the application of a European thinker's thought. So a lot of the bad books in Fanon are trying to find out if Fanon is Sartrean, Hegelian, is he Gramscian, is he Foucaultian, which is very weird because Foucault actually copied Fanon. And then it goes on and on. In fact, here's how bad. A book came out last year, I'm not kidding, that actually tried to argue Fanon's only value is that he was a proto-Benedict Anderson. And in most of you in this room are thinking, who the hell is Benedict Anderson? So there's this whole world of trying to subordinate Fanon precisely because it's connected to a problem of thought to begin with. In my book, Existentia Africana, I call it the problem through which one tries to legitimate theory as theory in a nutshell as white. Now, at first, there was very good reason for a lot of blacks, and you see it in feminist discourse too, to look for experience. Because you see, if you're told you're not a human being, that you don't have an inner life, you try to show you have a point of view, and you say, this is my experience. And it's to the point where, for instance, if you go across this country and you go and look at many departments, the moment you put black anything, you see right after it, you know it's coming, experience. I often quip, it's usually in the voice of Barry White. You know, every February you hear about the black experience. But the problem that everybody knows about experience, you all have had this experience, and I talk about in Existentia Africana. Everybody has the experience of trying to figure out her or his experience. You all know that the conversation usually has the form of, something just happened and what happened? And when you talk it through, you're trying to bring a theory or meaning to the experience to understand it. And that is an effect, but if you take the position that the only category of meaning and theory comes from the experience of the people you have defined as the source of theory, then you in effect say your experience is illegitimate. So if you're going to deal with the legitimacy of your experience, you must take responsibility for the theory you bring to that experience. So the first thing one finds out in African diasporic philosophy is a critique of the notion of reductive, racially reduced experience, theory. Theory is that which belongs to everybody. And once you begin to see this, one of the things about Fanon that becomes very crucial is that Fanon is addressing the very question of how we think. And one of his contributions there is what we could call the decolonization of thought. So in effect then, part of my task in writing What Fanon Said was to bring back the question of the intellectual value of his thought. But of course, if you say what someone said, there's always somebody could say, well, did he really say that? Did he say otherwise? Which means, of course, you have to go from said to mean. What did someone mean by what he or she said? And with Fanon, it's difficult because Fanon was an ironic, poetic writer. It gets even more complicated because Fanon wrote in French, and the translations many of us have are really not only distortions, but some people have built whole literature around discrediting Fanon for things he literally did not say. So in this book, all the translations are mine. And what I do is I show the French in many places and explain why I translated, sometimes awkwardly for me, to preserve meaning, so at least you can make up your mind, okay? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Fanon, Fanon was born in 1925 in the island of Martinique. That year, Malcolm X, all right, El-Malik al-Shabazz, or I saw the poster over there, Patrice Lumumba was born. As I put it, a vintage year for revolutionaries. Yeah, you could, you know, it was like, yo, man, it's time to make some revolutionaries. Fanon was one of these rather very unusual young men. They used to tease him, call him Bergson when he was a child because he read philosophy books. But he was also a person who was a fighter. And in fact, one of the things about Fanon to bear in mind is that Fanon, when the island of Martinique, when he was 17 years old, was full of Vichy or Nazi-supported officers on the island who were going around bullying people. Fanon did something that was very important. When a group of white sailors came up to bully Fanon, he kicked their ass. He fought back. And one of the things Fanon realized was when he fought back, it wasn't a matter of who won the fight. You see what I'm getting at? The issue for Fanon was that he understood the importance of standing up for yourself. That if he had walked away from there groveling, please don't hit me, please don't hurt me, he would go through a sense of diminished esteem. Now, his point is not that everybody has to go clobber people. But Fanon was curious about what this phenomenon was way before he became a psychiatrist. The other thing about Fanon was that Fanon, contrary to what many of you may hear about Fanon, was a humanist, and as I speak you'll see why, who detested violence. So one of the ways the violence discourse is used is the same way it's used pretty much generally around not only the streets and the stores and jobs to discredit the validity, especially of black men. If you want to make someone get rid of a black male working anywhere, you just have to say, he makes me feel unsafe. And so in a way to close off dealing with Fanon was to structure him in terms of something he detested. Now, although Fanon detested violence, Fanon has a very nuanced reading of violence that scared the crap out of a lot of people. And as I speak, I will point out what that is. But to show how his humanism comes in, it's very important to understand this. When Fanon was a youth, he witnessed the autopsy of a woman who died in a car accident. And it so disgusted him that he realized he was a humanist. Why? Because Fanon could not separate the human being from the cadaver. When he was later a medical student, Fanon had trouble with anatomy, the class anatomy, because he couldn't separate the cadaver from the person. When he said, "This is giving me trouble," his professor said to him, "Pretend it's a cat." Now, in a way, that hints at something very important for us to understand some of the issues at work. Because, of course, pretend it's a cat is to say pretend it's not a human being. And this is an insight that Fanon paid attention to that returns over and over in his writing. Because you see, Fanon, unlike a lot of other people who study racism, argues against most people who say racism is about the self and the other. In fact, you hear it all the time, I don't want to be othered. I don't want to be the other. And Fanon is like, man, if you're the other, at least you're another human being. The fact is what racism is about is to say there's the self, there's the other, and then there are those outside of the realm of self and other. And Fanon calls that the zone of non-being. When you're in the zone of non-being, it means that people could do anything they damn well please to you. And if you look at the history, the brutality, the lynchings, all the things that's been done, the experiment to create gynecology on live black women during the period of slavery, you know what that is. Pretend it's a cat. Now, one of the things we know, and I've written about it in some of my writings about bad faith, is racism depends on a very important lie. It's to see another human being and then say to yourself, I don't see another human being. But in order to do it, you have to identify a human being to then deny the other human being. You see what I'm getting at? So it's a performative lie. And Fanon understood that. But the next thing that comes up is something that will probably blow your mind. Because you see, early in his life, Fanon had a real issue. When many people think about issues such as death, many people think of death, for instance, Grim Reapers, dark stuff. For Fanon, death was white. And the whiteness of death is a theme that returns in his life. I know, that's something that may surprise some of you. Now, the thing about Fanon was that Fanon, when he discovered he's a humanist, for Fanon, being a humanist means you see how you're connected to all human beings. So when World War II emerged, Fanon volunteered to go fight in the French resistance. When he was ready to go out to fight, one of the lycée professors said to him, this is French high school, he said, "Fanon, why are you going to go fight a white man's war?" And Fanon said, "White man's war? Look, wherever there's this injustice, wherever there's dehumanization, wherever you're dealing with the degradation of human beings, I will be there." So he went off to go fight. Well, when he went off to go fight, the first thing he found out was that the black volunteers were put in the hull of the ship like a slave ship. He found out the black women, yes, black women volunteered to fight in the French resistance. He found out those women were told that they had to sleep in the cabins with the white officers. So these women, in fighting for France as French women, were being made into sexual tools. When Fanon landed in Africa, now, you know, there's always a special moment when New World blacks go to Africa. You know, you're from the Caribbean or from, you know, a lot of people talk about it, you know. The brothers landed, the sisters landed, we're in Africa. They landed in Africa, they moved it, they said, "There's an African." They walked up, and the Africans looked at them and said, "Niggers." Could you imagine the insult to land on the continent and be called nègre? The word nègre in French means, I usually in the book refer to nègre because it means both nigger and negro. And they were shocked. They were like, "Yo, who are you talking to?" So they went and got special berets to show, you know, because as we know under racism, it's not as neat as we would think. So some cases, some blacks are supposed to be better than other blacks. Martinicans are supposed to be better than Haitians, better than Senegalese, that kind of a thing. But they were being humiliated every step of the way. When they would fight to liberate villages, towns in Europe, there were instances in which a liberated town would ask for the Germans who were persecuting them to be let out so they could dance with them to celebrate, instead of the black men and women who liberated them. So after these countless humiliations, the black soldiers were then sent back ahead. So when France was, you know, celebrating its victory, people won't see black soldiers. The black soldiers were put in a ship with minimum rations, sent a cargo ship of all things, back to Martinique. And Fanon showed back up and the professor said, "So Fanon, you fought the war." And Fanon said, "I fought a white man's war." But Fanon didn't give up on humanity. So Fanon began to become very active in the very question of the struggle for freedom. And in that struggle, Fanon decided that he was going to go, because his family had, there were all kinds of difficulties. From a family of 10, reduced to 8. Fanon goes to France, and at first, he was going there to study dentistry. And yeah, you could imagine the puns, revolutionary dentist. It was funny, when I brought that up in Nairobi, my host, it turns out this was this radical guy who organized all kinds of meetings, Pan-African Baraza, and he was like, "Yo!" Turned out he was a dentist. Revolutionary dentist. But Fanon eventually made his way down to Lyon, where he studied psychiatry. And here's the thing that some of you may not realize. When he studied psychiatry, Fanon studied psychiatry and philosophy. With whom did he study philosophy? Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Psychiatry, later on he studied with, this is a longer story, but he studied with a fellow by the name of Francois Tesquel. He's a Catalan psychiatrist who had a theory about mental health linked to the very question of how one deals with the socialization of people in the world. In other words, that there are social causes of mental illness. But in this period, he studied forensic psychiatry and he studied clinical psychiatry, okay? Now, in forensic psychiatry at that time, it meant that not only did you deal with the question of what may have happened in crime, in other words, he is a psychiatric detective, but at that time, forensic psychiatrists also did autopsies. And this is crucial because, you see, when we talk about Fanon and violence, the thing we don't often realize is that he was born in a world of violence. Because when we talk about violence, we often fail to appreciate that colonialism and racism are ongoing systems of violence. So the first critical position Fanon took in violence was this. Fanon was concerned that people would say they're anti-violence, but they nevertheless can go to bed at night comfortably in a world of ongoing systemic violence. People, for instance, are always talking about nonviolence. And you hear this. You hear, for instance, that the civil rights struggle was nonviolent. You hear that the South African anti-apartheid struggle was nonviolent. But what's missing in that equation is that if you look at those histories, there were black people being butchered and murdered all over the place. In South Africa, there were black people being destroyed everywhere. So you begin to realize how racism functions in the logic of violence. Violence is defined as happening if and only if white people are harmed. You can destroy, harm as many black people, and it's called a nonviolent struggle. So the question is, how does that happen? And part of what happens is back to that zone of non-being, back to that pretend it's a cat. If your humanity is not acknowledged, then the very idea of you appearing is even considered a violent moment. So in effect, if you look at a lot of the arguments about nonviolence, they ultimately are connected to something called illicit appearance. It's about the people in whom the system is considered legitimate if they do not appear. So if you come now to Fanon, after Fanon had his medical degree, he went briefly back home to Martinique. And one additional encounter with violence that many people don't talk about is that Fanon, as a forensic psychiatrist, looked at violence not only in its political and larger military context, but he understood their relationship to things such as what you may be surprised to find out, domestic violence. When he was in Martinique, he came across a case of a woman who was killed 3 months earlier. The records didn't look right to Fanon, so he had the body exhumed. And he did an autopsy of the body, and he determined the woman died from domestic violence. Fanon began to press the society to do something about it, and a lot of the people wouldn't do anything. And so Fanon began to realize that if you're going to deal with this question, really deal with this question of violence, you're going to have to deal with how violence plays itself out at societal levels. So when he went back to France and studied to be a chef de service, that led to him going to Algeria. And when he went to Algeria, he began to see how the French were treating the Berbers, the Arabs, the other ethnic groups in Algeria. And from Fanon's point of view, he knew which side he was going to be on. So Fanon became this person he found himself in this unusual situation. He would have a patient come in and say, "Doctor, I need help." "What's the problem?" "Well, I had to torture someone today. I had to slap him up, or I had to take her in, bash her head in, rape her, electrodes, do all these things. Help me, doctor." Could you imagine that? Help me be a happy torturer. But then Fanon would later have another patient. "Help me, doctor, help me." "What's the matter?" "Well, I was dragged in, raped, butchered, I was tortured, I'm barely alive. How can I survive this?" So he found himself treating the torturer and the tortured. And it's within that framework Fanon realized that he was dealing with what we call a sick society. And in fact, one of Fanon's positions is that you do not, how are you going to practice psychiatry, which is to make a person adjusted, attuned to a society, when in effect it makes that person, let's pick a person on the racism. How do you make a person happy with racism? In effect, the problem that Fanon was facing is the problem of the happy slave, which for Fanon was an obscenity. So if you bring Fanon's forensic training, psychiatric training, and philosophy together, you see how Fanon began to see the world he lived in. The world of colonialism for Fanon was like a crime scene. And in that crime scene were bodies around, people who were butchered, people who were harmed. But the problem he faced is that the people who called him to do the investigation were the ones who committed the crime. But he was asked to investigate it without acknowledging the criminals. And in fact, if you look at all of his writings, it's about dealing with this question of hidden responsibility for the world in which we live. So we begin now to come where Fanon became then, he joined the FLN, the Front Libération Nationale. He became part of the Algerian struggle. He became a wanted man in France. A group called the Red Hand were trying to kill him. In fact, he led a kind of Robin Hood existence. So for instance, one of the things, now this is when you know you are a serious intellectual. There is a country that wants to kill you, but suddenly somebody announces Black Writers Congress. And you ever watch out Robin Hood when they say there's the arrow competition? You know, Robin Hood couldn't resist. Black Writers Congress. And James Baldwin wrote about it. He went to the Black Writers Congress, for instance, in Paris, and he noticed something. There were two Amy Césaires, because Fanon signed in as Amy Césaire. And, you know, Baldwin was like, yo, man, Amy Césaire is cool, but that young Amy Césaire was rocking. And Fanon did a lecture there called Racism and Culture. If you ever get a chance, I talk about it in the book, but if you get a chance, read the essay. There were these other contexts where, yeah, there were always these things that he would come in under different names, okay? And this kind of a situation, when people, you know, there were times if Fanon is booking a flight, he would then take a train. If he books a train, he'd then switch to a car, because there were people trying to kill him. In fact, there was one case where he was in a Jeep that was blown up. He was thrown over. He was in a hospital in Rome, and the newspapers in Rome put, Frantz Fanon, revolutionary from Algeria, in hospital room, blah, 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 blah. And Fanon sort of said, get me the hell out of this room. And it was like a scene from The Godfather. They got him out of the room. And then suddenly the doors kicked open, and all these guys with machine guns were there, and for the better, like, yo, where is he? Okay? However, as he continued to struggle, there were all kinds of other efforts. Fanon, for instance, wanted to be relocated to Cuba. Could you imagine Fanon in Cuba? And then there were all of these other things, and where Fanon would address meetings in Ghana. He was helping to open up fronts into Algeria across the Sahara Desert. But eventually, Fanon didn't look good. Now, Fanon not looking good is a serious matter. Why? And Floyd Hayes could attest to this. When I did Fanon a critical reader, my two co-editors were Tracy Sharpley Whiting and Renee Teresa White. And we had to decide on a cover, so I got all my Fanon photographs together, you know what I mean? And when I got them together, I put them out, and I said, which one are we going to choose? And suddenly the two women weren't standing next to me. They were at the window doing this. And they were like, yo, Louis, you didn't tell us the brother was that fine. Fanon was a good-looking man. He was always dressed impeccably. In fact, and it wasn't a shock because he knew people they called him negative names. They called him the nigger psychiatrist. You know, I mean, the racism was real. Fanon kept 3 suits in his office where he would change throughout the day. He was always looking good. Suddenly, Fanon looked bad. And it was because he was dying from leukemia. And I talk about this in the book. Try to imagine a person who spent his life fighting against racism. And you know the old language of racism was, what blood are you? You have Indian blood, black blood, white blood. Picture somebody like that having leukemia, blood cancer, what it must have meant for his blood to be eating him. What makes it even more complicated is that Fanon's mother was half Alsatian. His mother's father was white, and his mother's mother was black. And his father's mother was black, and his father's father was East Indian. And so you could imagine this complicated thing of dying from that kind of an illness when your very embodiment is worlds coming together. And Fanon he first went to the Soviet Union to see about, what could be done. And they said the best place to go is the United States. And Fanon said, do I really have to go to a nation of lynchers? Now, why did he say this? Well, in France, his wife was Egyptian, Gypsy, and Corsican. That's not like white. But in the United States, that's a white woman. And to be in Maryland, a black man married to a white woman, you don't want any Jack Daniels on a rope. So Fanon came to DC, where he was first put in the DuPont Hotel. And a lot of you don't know this, but the DuPont had a floor that was reserved for revolutionaries. That's why Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, a lot of those people stayed on that floor for free. The owners at that time kept that floor for that purpose. And he was eventually he was kept from treatment and contracted pneumonia. And he died on December 6th, 1961, okay? Now, when we talk about Fanon, the thing now is about his thought. That's his life. And there are many things I could talk about. For instance, when I talk about his first book, Black Skin, White Mask, it's very funny with that first book, because he had originally proposed it as his doctoral dissertation. It was originally called Sur la désaliénation des nègres, on the désaliénation of le nègre. But his professors were like, nah, we're not down with that. They rejected it. So what did Fanon do? He went and wrote another dissertation in 2 weeks and submitted it on Friedreich's disease and got his doctorate. Yeah, I did say he makes people look bad. But he was very clever, because the argument he made in the disease, in his analysis of it in that dissertation, was really the same argument he made in the désaliénation of le nègre. Because what he argued is that there's a tendency, especially with a debilitating disease like Friedreich disease, that affects the spine, the patient is helpless, that there's a tendency to fail to deal with the humanity of the patient. And the failure in medicine to deal with the humanity of the patient contributes to the malediction. Now, one of the theses in the désaliénation of le nègre is that the failure to deal with the humanity of the people, the fact that human beings are involved in issues of social change, maintains the malediction. So what happens next is rather interesting. Fanon then takes the original thesis to Francis Janson, and Janson was a protege of Jean-Paul Sartre. And Janson loved the book, so he said, I want to publish it. So Fanon goes to meet with him, and when he says, I love the book, I want to publish it, Fanon says, you mean it's not bad for a nigger, huh? And Janson looks at him, goes to the door, opens it, says, get out of my office. And Fanon smiled and said, we can work together. Because Fanon refused to be patronized. And then Janson said to him, well, we need to change one thing. He said, what? The title. I think a better title is Peau Noire Masque Blanc. And so the title became Black Skin, White Mask. And I'm not going to focus on that book tonight, but I figure in discussion, question, and answer, certain things will come out. But one of the things in the book that's very crucial I'd like to bring up is connected to my earlier remark about the relationship of black intellectuals to white intellectuals. When a white intellectual cites a white intellectual, people call that an influence, or they may call it a dialogue or engagement. But when a black intellectual cites a white intellectual and engages it, a black intellectual is treated as if the black intellectual is a subordinate of the white intellectual. In Black Skin, White Mass, Fanon takes on Jean-Paul Sartre. And he gives this criticism of Sartre because Sartre, in an essay called Orphée Noir, Black Orpheus, argues that negritude, the black movement, that you deal with black consciousness as connection to the African continent, that negritude was a form of anti-racist racism that will radicalize blacks to prepare them for the universal struggle with the white working class. And Fanon said, in effect, Sartre subordinated black reality to subsume it into whiteness. Remember I said whiteness for him was death. For him, that's the death of black thought. And what he said Sartre failed to understand is that genuine dialectical thinking is not closed, but open. That for black revolutionary work to be revolutionary, it has to have contingency, possibility. And one of the things to bear in mind about this is a lot of us don't understand the distinction between contingency and accident. You see, in the human world, there's contingency, that's why there's freedom. But nothing that goes down is accidental. The world that we're living in today, everything that's going on is not accidental because they are functions of human agency. So in effect, what Fanon was arguing is that if you're going to deal with the question of social transformation, if you're going to deal with questions such as revolution, it requires putting the human being back into human relations. And what many people are looking for are models in which somehow words, thought, ideas function like wizardry. That if you can get the right words, like an incantation, you change the world. But what Fanon was arguing is no, the words are to help you clarify what you are to do. So in effect, Fanon was making what we could call an important existential political thesis, which is praxis will produce the thought, the ideas in the world to come, but you must take responsibility for it. And in fact, a lot of Fanon's thought is about that question of responsibility. And how radical is it? Well, you see, we're not just responsible for trying to build the ethical face, the political actions at hand. More radically, and you know that point I said about justification, we're even responsible for responsibility. So it means that if you're going to be committed to issues of social change for Fanon, you have to ask, in a nutshell, what you going to do? What are you willing to take on? Bless you. So now we come into this question of violence. I'm going to talk about violence because that's the big issue going on. And a lot of people are not paying attention to what's going on in the world today and how someone like Fanon is linked to it. So I start with a first Fanonian ironic thesis. There are a lot of people who love to argue whether Fanon was right or wrong. And what they don't know about Fanon is that Fanon earnestly, seriously wanted to be wrong. The worst thing for any revolutionary thinker who has a bad diagnosis is to be right. If right now the world was demonstrating that Fanon was wrong in everything he said, he'll be dancing in his grave. So there's a paradox. His being right for him is a failure of his argument. It's a paradox. He's right. He's right, which for him means the situation is so wrong. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, the next thing to bear in mind is to understand a concept that we talk a lot about, but don't pay attention to. And the concept is the concept of power. If you notice, people talk about power a lot today, and they even talk about power in ways that treat power as an intrinsically dirty word. You ever notice that? They're like, oh man, look at him with his power. I don't like all that power. Look at that abuse of power. But people rarely talk about what power is. And you know it, especially when you're in the academy. People love to use Foucault when they talk about power. They love a good European to tell you about power, but they never define it. So people go around, and in fact, they treat power as if it's intrinsically wrong. So why don't we start first with the question of what is power? Well, the world we live in today is a world that I wrote an essay called The Market Colonization of Intellectuals. And if you want to be very marketable as an intellectual, you know what you got to do? Make sure nobody understands you. And that means then the only person they could hire is the person who understands what you're saying, who is you. So people obfuscate things. So they may say that power is a certain micro-relation through which one is dealing with certain dichotomies, through which force may manifest itself in certain forms of apprehension of the soul locked in certain contained corporeality. And you all know what to call that. You all know what to call that. Should I say bullshit? But here's what power is. Power in a nutshell is simple, and people hate it. It's not marketable. But power simply is the ability to make things happen. It's the ability to make things happen. And what is the absolute mythic example? The example of the ability to make things happen in human consciousness in the past was God. Think about it. If God were to show up right now, and there's stereotypes, so I won't give God the booming voice. Let's give God Michael Jackson's voice, So if God were to show up and you say, yo, you're God? Yeah, I'm God. You're really God? Yeah, I'm God. The first thing every one of you will say is, do something. And if God goes, I can't, they're going to say, what kind of God are you? God is by definition the being who can make, God says, let there be light, there's light. If God says, change reality, it does. And it meant, right? So that's what God's about. But then we look at our bodies. We make things happen at a basic level with our bodies as animals through what we can touch, reach, but we're also creatures of language. So precisely because there's a mic here, we have technologies, and we have language, I'm physically here, but you in the back of the room can hear me, and I'm connected to you. So the ability to make something happen is now extended to the back of the room. And then, as Freud pointed out, we extend it with culture. And if you look at what culture is, Freud called culture a prosthetic God. Because if you think about it, culture does what historically we wanted God to do. What do we want God to do? Well, the first thing we want God to do, if you think about it, we want God to control the weather, right? Bad weather could really jack us up. So we're dealing with nature. The second thing that's crucial is that our bodies, we pray to God to make sure our bodies keep us alive. And the third thing that we pray for God to do, that we bring into culture, is to create social relations that protect us from killing each other. In other words, God gives us laws. And if you look at culture, culture gives us protection, shelter, technologies, language, laws, all those things. And in doing those things, they make things happen. It means the human being can move all over the planet, and that is power. You see, the problem is a lot of people think of power in the negative sense, and here's the negative sense, the Hobbesian view of power, which is power is when someone coercively limits your reach, takes the power from you, and privatizes it. And if you think about what you want from government, it's actually to distribute power, and to make things happen means government is to create services. So in effect, government power depends on the legitimacy of services. But if government stops producing services, you're going to say, well, what do we have you for? And if government begins to privatize, take the power from you, the more and more that is locked into your body. The point of having a society and government is for you not to be limited only to what you can physically do. Now, the reason that is crucial is because when power is diminished, when people have power, they can affect the world beyond their physical location. You could be sitting in this room and make a decision or send a text that affects someone in Japan, Australia, South America, in Africa, in Europe. But if you become locked more into your body, then you can only have an impact on what you can touch. Now, this is crucial because all forms of degradation, all kinds of racism, colonialism, is to limit the options through which a human being can reach out and collapse it into his or her body. When I looked at some of the videotapes of what was happening in this city, that's a classic example. Because you see, the community was compelled to be in a situation of throwing stones and other things at the police, the physical encounter, because there's a structure diminishing the power of the citizenry. And this is where it comes in, because you see, now we move to violence. Because you see, what violence is about is this. If you're walking and you bump into a wall, that's force with force, but there's no violence. Violence emerges in a human world. If a lion kills an antelope to eat it, that's simply nature at work. But in the human world of laws, there are phenomena called violations. And a violation could only occur when you understand yourself as a human being and something is taken from you. So it's not simply the physical thing, you know? You don't hit your toe in the bed and say, man, I'm going to shoot the bed. You don't bump into the wall and say, bad wall. But in the human world, you need to deal with what a human being does. If a human being pushes you into the wall, that is violence. You see what I'm getting at? And now once we have that, now we have the classic problem. Because if you look at colonialism, colonialism has a group of people who take something from another group of people. They are reducing their capacity to affect the world. But when they do it, take it, they add something to what they have taken. When they take something away, they call it right. Now really think about this. If a settler says, my possessing the land, the resources, the rules, my having that is right, what do you call taking it away from me? Wrong. And that becomes the definition in a settler society of violence. And now you have the problem. Because the people who it was taken away from, what did they say when it was taken away from them? You have wronged me. And Hegel, for instance, has a very great discussion of this, because now we have two models of right in conflict. And you see the problem? If these people keep their right, I must live with my ongoing wrong. That's the violation. To maintain that violation, force now, which before was the ability transformed into power to make things happen, the only thing happening is keeping me from being able to expand beyond my body. And that's why colonized people, any oppressed people, have their bodies policed, limited. And the limitation on the body means the human being is like someone trying to fly, but the legs are shackled. It becomes an agonizing relationship because, you see, if you can't act outward, what do? You turn inward. You try to exercise your agency on your body, so wherever there's oppression, there are always, and Fanon writes about this, there are always people trying to fix themselves. What is the history of black people in the Euro-modern world other than people obsessed with fixing themselves? But when you look at the world today, there's something peculiar going on. And this is how Fanon connects to these issues. Because you see, in that situation of it turned inward, if it keeps going inward, you begin to implode. You begin to harm yourself. It becomes mental illness. It becomes, I'm never good enough. I'm never right. My very existence becomes wrong. And think about the damage to a human being when your very existence is wrong. in a system where terra nullius, empty land, empty space, if a legitimate social field, a legitimate visual field is your absence, then your very appearance is an act of violence. Black men, black women walking in a store, violence. For the police officers, if they pursue you before you've done anything, what is the violation? You appeared. And once you begin to understand that, then it gets even more complicated. Because you see, you notice the language you use for the police is police force. Right? The reason is because if a state is legitimate, the force is not violence. They're not violating anything. Now, this is why we often lose with police brutality issues. Because once you start with the view that it is force, then the only debate is how much force. But you've never questioned the legitimacy of using force in the first place. If using force in the first place is illegitimate, then it's violence. And what we're really talking about in the world today is police violence. So why is there so much violence going on? Well, what Fanon did, and this is what shocked a lot of people, Fanon argued, let us imagine in the process of decolonization that you're going to demonstrate that it's nonviolent. What are the conditions, what are the criteria that would need to be met to convince the settler state that you're not violent? The problem is they've defined changing the state at all as violence. So the best way for you to be nonviolent is to do nothing. This means all settler states wage a war on political action. And this is where Fanon and Biko connect. Because Biko's genius linked to Fanon was, in his concept of black consciousness, was to point out black consciousness is political. So that means if you're going to repress black consciousness, you must repress politics. And the problem, of course, means you have to repress speech, you have to repress action, and in effect, then, the racist state becomes a war on politics itself and the people's ability to extend their power beyond them. Why? Because that means that state becomes one in which the greatest danger is democracy. Fanon was a radical Democrat. He believed power must be distributed into the public world. And where a state begins to privatize that power, and we hear privatization all around, it's no accident that the brutality, the violence across the world is a function of the privatization of governing power. So, and if you look at this city, you could already see that in terms of the economy of how privatization works. So now we come to this issue about what is going on when we begin now to deal with what it is to be what Fanon calls actional. Well, you see, what Fanon argues that we miss in politics is connected to that point I said about the prosthetic God, about culture, about why we have human institutions. It's precisely because healthy human beings for Fanon, mature human beings, are human beings whose actual impact reaches outward to the world. The more it's turned inward, it goes against you. So in effect, to close off the political agency of people is to commit a form of oppression and violence on them. And more, this means the relationship between the state apparatuses become one of violent relations. Now, Fanon was doing this because he was arguing against Engels. Because you see, Engels was arguing that the state must be in and of itself violence. But here, Fanon was suspicious. And the reason he was suspicious is straightforward. If you look at the history of almost every black revolutionary thinker, they have a version of what Martin Luther King called, "Why we can't wait." There are many people who say, when you become like us, then you can be free. And a lot of black thinkers said, yo, we're not down with that, because we can't be you. We have to be ourselves. And when you look at this question, it's a lot like the problem of what Fanon called arriving too late. It's like Euromodernity, states, all of these things are like a party. For instance, if you go and research what created what we call white wealth, whether it's in South Africa or in the United States, you know what created those things? The social welfare state. Socialism, those things. South Africa was a social welfare state for whites. The deal that was cut for the post-apartheid South Africa was to dismantle that state without an infrastructure for black people. That's why you have 70% black employment. And many people there look at these people and say, why are they poor? Why? Look in the United States, the history. The history was to create a social welfare state that created capital, white wealth, with conditions, deals cut all the way from the 19th century that blacks must not only be barred from it, but violently attacked from it. So the history of that attack were riots, police, and so forth. And this is why it's crucial to understand the big difference between those lynching riots and acts of terror. Because if you look at the black resistance that's been coming, that is properly a rebellion. That is properly an uprising, precisely because it's fighting not to eradicate the powers of people, but to expand the powers of people. How do we know? Because one crucial thing about today that's different from yesterday is that when you look across the globe in the people who are fighting against this brutality, you may notice that they are multiracial. In the past, it was white communities destroying black communities. But if you look at the people who are standing up against the state apparatus, the mediating force, the police, you see multiracial coalition. And you have to ask yourself, what is compelling young white people, young Asians, young Syrians to go to the streets around the solidarity of this issue? And it's because they can't breathe. It's because they're seeing a connection in their lives and those at the front line. And so the Fanonian part comes in a very crucial way, because you see what Fanon reminds us of, and I'm going to end here so we could get to discussion. What Fanon reminds us of is that if you're going to fight for social change, it's not only the question of the standing up and fighting it, but it's the ongoing struggle to build the concepts through which you do not find yourself creating another world in which you have kept the same. Fanon's criticism in Le Damné de la Terre, and in the book I explain why I call it the damned of the earth, his criticism is that decolonization, the reason it's always violent is because it's simply replacing one group with another group, but keeping the system the same. If you're going to create a genuine revolutionary situation, it's not simply replacing people, but it's changing the systemic relations. And changing those relations, he argues, requires building new concepts. It requires changing the material conditions. It requires understanding the human being in a different way. The old way of understanding human beings were as things that are intact and the world changes around us. Fanon rejects that and asks us to understand that we are relationships. And in those relationships, when you change one relationship, you change others. We're living in a world in which you don't simply pick up women and put them in, pick up blacks and put them in and keep the system the same. That's the fantasy. The truth is, the moment you try to bring one relationship into another, you're producing new kinds of people. And we know that because the humanity we see today is a changing, transforming one in which we have no idea what we're going to be as a species tomorrow. And for Fanon, that is the act of freedom, the openness, that really makes the possibility of the human being that which, for him, is not only a question, but the encomium, the task, to make things happen. Thank you.
Well, obviously, the floor is open. Let's hear some questions. Anybody?
If you don't mind, because I know it's a little bit late, why don't anybody with a question, I could just take all of them, and please say your name, and don't worry, I'll respond. Oh, we have the Jeopardy moment. Yes, say your name loudly for everyone.
I was wondering if you're familiar with the work of Frank Wilderson and how Frank Wilderson's work relates to Frantz Fanon.
Okay, next person. Oh, please. Oh, would you mind using the mic? It'll make it easier. Sorry about that. Please say your name too.
Okay, my name is Rose. I'd like for you to say more about the relationship piece, the systemic relationships you talked about.
Okay. Another person, please. Well, I guess we have two. Oh, back there. Yes, and over here. Please come on up and ask your question.
Well, I mean, of course, the classical understanding of Fanon and violence is that while he hates violence, he sees it as an important transformationally informing a community among the colonial people. I just wanted, one of the things I was hoping you would talk about a little bit about whether you see the same kind of thing happening in communities like Baltimore when people mobilize against the police, subordinated communities sort of coming together, developing new forms of power on, kind of the way Fanon talked about under colonialism.
Okay, and right over here. Oh, there's over there and then over here.
I just like to make a comment, reinforcing what you're saying about how people make statements or commitments and channel the same things. And you mentioned Stephen Biko. When they asked Stephen Biko about Mandela when he was in prison, Stephen Biko said, under apartheid, they never keep anybody alive unless they're going to use them later. Right.
No, right over here and over here. This woman here and over there. Please say your name.
Hi, my name is Alex. I guess I'd just like to know if you have any advice for all of us. We've just heard you speak. I have a problem with these kind of ideas remaining in academia. These concepts are really hard to communicate to, like, for want of a better word, the general population. So what are we all going to take away from this, and what are we going to do tomorrow after hearing all this? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Coley Tingala. I was wondering, what is your feeling about going through this transformation, understanding the history of human beings? Should we resign ourselves to the fact that it's going to be a long haul? I have debates with dear friends of mine, people who are diametrically opposed to my worldview. Changing hearts and minds as opposed to trying to change the rules of engagement in terms of dealing with humanity, of trying to set up an infrastructure that will guide people into embracing difference and diversity on a genuine, authentic level. But what you just said about trying to replacing systems, individuals with and maintaining the same system, or should we just accept that reaching that point of embracing humanity on the intrinsic level of humanity, trying to change hearts and minds as opposed to trying to change the infrastructure and the rules of life engagement to guide people into embracing?
Yes, you have a question? Sure, no, go ahead.
The issue of systematic changes, real changes. One of the biggest struggles in the world has always been not repeating the same cycle. You replace those folks through revolution, you replace them with, but you still put in the same because of the value system and the ideas. How do you educate, politically educate people correctly so they can understand clearly that there's no difference, that they have to do something different. We have to change the world differently. And not be afraid of violence, because violence is something that's necessary. We all understand that there never been any change in the world of violence. But the one of the strangest things most revolutionaries say, the hardest thing for them to do is to make that switch.
Hey.
And that's the issue. How do we also make that switch if it's necessary?
Oh, you have a question? Go ahead. Yes.
My question's very short. So I heard you mention feminism once or twice, but you didn't directly connect it to Fanon, his analysis. So I was wondering, would you consider him a womanist, a feminist? Because he sounds very intersectional based on some of the things you said.
Okay. Is there anybody else? Yes, right here. And over there.
Hello, my name is Karine. Thank you so much for your talk. I think my question piggybacks on the last two questions as well. One of them, speaking about rules of engagement, talking about how do we move forward with the process of creating a new society. I mean, my understanding that Fanon has a strong connection to socialism, and I wonder if in his work, was he sort of putting forward the idea that perhaps this would be happening, you know, with a focus on the economic understructure of how systems of oppression are created through whether it be capitalism, or is there more of a language around you know, other systems of oppression and how one goes through that? I also think it would be interesting, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to, I mean, you talked a little bit about language and how that affects the way that we, you know, interpret these systems of oppression. And I wonder, I mean, because I'm hearing some of us are talking about educating communities and telling them what they need to do, and I wonder about, what does he think about how to engage communities? Because I wonder if maybe part of the problem is thinking we're going to go into community and say this is what we're going to do, versus the community, engaging community in a way to sort of create that language for that new world. I don't know if that made any sense.
It did.
Nous sommes le pouvoir. You were saying that change entails, power entails change, whereas inasmuch as the system delimits change, I think that requires a break with the quote-unquote system.
Okay, a lot of the questions are related. And as I speak, the first thing to bear in mind, you may wonder why in the beginning of the talk I talked about philosophical anthropology. And many people, when they're trying to talk about social change, they never think about what a human being is. And this is something Fanon pays attention to. Many people want to have closed conceptions of human beings because then human beings can be predictable. And in fact, in Fanon's writing, he gave an example in which he said one of the problems is that when he would walk in, reason seems to walk out. Now, one problem we have to bear in mind when we try to look at the question of human beings in terms of rigid closed systems is that we often are trying to get as a model of how we work as theorists on issues of social change that are actually based on what we can call law-like generalizations. Now, what is a law-like generalization? It is when you make sure that whatever you say has no contradiction down the line. So if you are to say this much, the next stage must be consistent with it, and the next stage until you are maximally consistent. Do you get that? But here's the problem, and I can just put it in a nutshell. Nobody in this room would like to date, be married to, or be a best friend with a maximally consistent person. You know what that is. It's hell. And this tells you something, because if somebody were maximally consistent, you know what you would say? That person's not reasonable. And we have a person here who does work in Hegel who can point out this insight, that a human being has the ability to evaluate rationality. Now, why is that important? Because you see, the mistake many of us make is we want to push the human being into that maximum law-like generalization model. So when we think about our philosophical anthropology, some people, the question about intersectionality, for instance, what some people don't understand is what intersectionality is raising is important insight. Nowhere is there ever a human being who's ever one identity? People talk about race. You ever really see a race walking? You see a racialized man or woman, or trans man or trans woman, or hermaphrodite. You see what I'm getting at? Do you ever see a class walking? Class is embodied in flesh and blood people, and we could go on and on. A man, a woman, a color, or so forth. So if we enrich our philosophical anthropology, we begin to notice certain other things. And one of the other things we begin to realize is that we commit a serious problem when we do political work. And the problem is this. The question about Wilderson, for instance, there is this discussion going on, and a lot of people build it out of some of my early books. I have a category I call, as a metaphor, an anti-black world. You got it? Now, you notice the indefinite article, an anti-black world. The reason I say that is because the world is different from an anti-black world. The project of racism is to create a world that will be completely anti-black or anti-woman. You see what I'm getting at? Although that's a project, it is not a fait accompli. People don't seem to understand how recent this phenomenon we're talking about is. A lot of people talk about race, they don't even know the history of how race is connected into theonaturalism, how, for instance, in Andalusia and pushing out the Moors, the history of how race connected to Christianity was formed. A lot of people don't understand that from the standpoint of a species that's 220,000 years old, what the hell is 500 years? But the one thing that we don't understand too is we create a false model of how we study those 500 years. We study the 500 years as if the people who have been dominated have not been fighting and resisting. Had they not been fighting and resisting, we wouldn't be here. And then we come into this next point. Because you see, the problem in the formulation pessimism and optimism is they're both based on forecasted knowledge, of prior knowledge. But human beings don't have prior knowledge. And in fact, what in the world are we if we need to have guarantees for us to act? You know what you call such people? Cowards. The fact of the matter is, our ancestors, think about, let's just start with enslaved ancestors. The enslaved ancestors who were burning down those plantations, who were finding clever ways to poison bastards, who were organizing meetings for rebellions, none of them had any clue about what the future would be 100 years later. In fact, some had good reason to believe it may have even taken 1,000 years. But you know why they fought? Because they knew it wasn't for them. One of the problems we have in the way we think about political issues is we commit what Fanon and others who have thought in the existential tradition would call a form of political immaturity. Political immaturity is it's not worth it unless me individually get the payoff. When you're thinking about what it is to relate to other generations, remember Fanon said the problem with the people in the transition, the pseudo post-colonial bourgeoisie, is that they miss the point. You fight for liberation for other generations. And that's why Fanon said other generations, they must have their mission. But you see, some people fought and they say, now I want my piece of the pie. And that means the biggest enemy becomes the other generations. And that is why the post-colonial pseudo-bourgeoisie, they're not a bourgeoisie proper because they do not link to the infrastructural development of the future. It's about themselves, and that's why, for instance, as they live high off the hog, as they get their mediating, service-oriented, racial mediation wealth, the rest of the populations are in misery. The very fact that in many African countries there are people whose future have been mortgaged. The fact that in this country, that very example of mortgaging the future of all of you is there. What happens to people when they have no future? It now collapses the concept of maturation and places people into perpetual childhood. So one of the political things, and this is where a psychiatrist philosopher is crucial, is to ask ourselves, what does it mean to take on adult responsibility? And that means to understand in all political action, it's not about you. It's what you are doing for a world you may not even be able to understand. Now that becomes tricky because how do we know this? People have done it before. There were people, for instance, who fought anti-colonial struggles. There are people, and I'm talking about like 30, 40 years ago. I'm talking about the people from day one, from the 17th century, the 18th century, all the way through, and we right now, we have no idea of what we're doing for the 22nd century. And this is where developing political insight comes in, because we commit the error of forgetting that systems, the systems we're talking about, are human systems. They're not systems in the way that we can talk about, for instance, the law of physics. A human system can only exist by human actions maintaining them, which means every human system is like that model of reason evaluating completeness. Every human system is incomplete. A human being is by definition incomplete, which means you can go this way or you can go another way. And it's that fundamental incompleteness that raises the question. The system isn't actually closed. How do we know it? The reason we're seeing all this brutality in the world today is because the systems are breaking down. If the systems were working, they wouldn't have to worry. You know how you have an effective system? You make people mentally be their own prisoners. If the system were really working, you wouldn't have to have the police, because you all would do it for them. It's the very fact that that system is breaking down that we're seeing heightened brutality. But the problem with heightened brutality is it's not sustainable. There are studies, for instance, if you look at a paper called Mr. Y, done by the military advisors in this country. They argue that using military force to maintain the United States' strength is not sustainable. It means that they argue what is sustainable is for a nation to learn to be good citizens in the world, which means it has to build up its infrastructure for education, human relations. It has to deal with the ecology, the environment, all of those things. And this is what many people are learning all over the world. And so one of the things we have to bear in mind then is this. When we begin to engage in these struggles, we have to understand how we have to think differently. And here's what I mean. If you look at neoconservatism, its goal is to push us into the late 17th, early 18th century. Hobbesianism. It's all about order, control. That's what you're seeing in the streets right now, not only in this country, but also in Latin America and parts of Europe. And then you have neoliberalism, and people use the term, but they don't explain what it is. Neoliberalism wants to have free markets, and at the same time, it wants to create a unique form of vulnerability, which it places through 19th century thought, which is that you are to look at yourself as an individual. Neoliberals say that they don't believe in group rights, only individual rights. Now, you know what an individual is when you're dealing with a mechanism like a government, a society. An individual is simply a vulnerable being. So in effect, that conception of rights is to assure that you have a population that's completely vulnerable to the domination of a system. Now, the problem is, many people, when they respond to neoconservatism and neoliberalism, attack it through being anti-globalism. But it's because we have neoliberal globalism, neoconservative globalism. So what they do is they abrogate, they give up, and this is connected to your case, they give up the concrete levels in which people can build alternative ways of imagining a global future. Now, here's the thing. On the neoliberalism, the idea is to make you forget the 20th century. Why? The 20th century was the age of revolution. They want you to think 19th and 18th to 17th century. And then they tell you that every revolutionary effort of the 20th century failed. And this is where Fanon is interesting. Because you see, he brings an insight. You need to understand the concept of failure differently. And I'll give you an example. A lot of things that I've worked with, and groups I've worked with, communities, when we work together, every time we have a project, we always had people, and Floyd witnessed early in my career the same thing in different contexts. There are others who have known me, for instance, Roberts, all kinds of groups. Whenever we're trying to do something, you know what? There's always somebody who says, don't do that. And you say, why? And they said, we tried. You see what I'm getting at? If I couldn't do it, nobody could do it. But what they don't understand is that their failure already started setting the conditions for a new kind of relation. All of those people, you know, I went in, when I was president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, I went and lectured in nearly every country in which there were slaves to deal in 2008 with the end of the British Atlantic slave trade. And you know what's funny? If you hear the popular histories, you hear that slave revolts failed. The crappy history you have is that one day a group of people in England or in France or in Denmark said, you know, slavery is a really bad thing. Let us get rid of it. Now, that is not the actual history. Everywhere I went and looked in the archives of the local history, every single instance, it was a slave revolt. Every single one. The Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica is what led to the question of getting rid of the Atlantic slave trade. If you look in Denmark, if you look among the Dutch, and the Dutch had a much larger slave trade. The British were pirates. They took it over. And when you go and look in that history, and I give you an example. A lot of you all don't know that Denmark had a whole colonial structure. And if you go to Denmark, if you go to Copenhagen, you'll see a statue of a man, I forget his name right now, but a governor, and it says, "Free the slaves." Okay? Now, you go to St. Martin, you go to what became the U.S. Virgin Islands, and you get the actual story. Here's the story. It always boggles my mind how slavery functioned. They had a fort, and they had enslaved people bring the supplies and everything into the fort. You got it? Now, as they bring, it also boggles my mind that slave masters had slaves cook for them. But anyway, the people will come in and they'll deliver supplies. And one morning, the governor woke up, and outside the entire fort was surrounded by black enslaved people wearing white. And you better watch out when you see some Africans wearing white. Remember, I told you about white. They had machetes, pitchforks, and they just looked at the fort. And so the governor came out and said, "Disband." And they just stood there. And then he said, he ordered the men to, the soldiers to aim the guns at them. He said, "Disband or we'll shoot." And the people stood. And then he ordered fire, and none of the guns worked. Because every day they came in, they replaced gunpowder with sand. And then you know what he said? "Well, now you're all free." Now, the thing about the Danes is they were Lutherans, and they would follow their law. If their law said the governor's law, and he says you're free, you're free. And now, those islands were not of use to the Danes, and there was a period of, equality, rights, all of this happening. They sold the islands to the United States that implemented segregation and all kinds of other things. But the point in the story is very different. The point is, you have one history that said he freed the slaves, and the actual history is no, the slaves freed themselves. Nowhere in history, and this is the Fanonian point, nowhere in history, any kind of domination, it's not only about dealing with the question of slave communities, we're talking about structural violence of many kinds. People talk about, for instance, who created a women's movement? The answer is women and men, but mostly women, who cared about their liberation. We are able to look at the world different because women fought. It's not that they sat down and said, "Treat me better." They got up and went out in the streets. Every instance of people doing political activism really works. The error people make is that they think just because in the past there were so-called overcome rebellions, they don't realize the rebellions changed the conditions. And so there is no such thing. This is why I brought that story on. He didn't fight with the presumption he will win. He fought because he had to. And why did he have to? It wasn't in the sense of just self-defense. He had to precisely because he knew it was the right thing to do. Real political work is about doing what is necessary with an understanding because it should be done and it's not about you. And so if we come to the concrete levels, you need to argue, look closely at what you're doing that will connect. If it's going to be action beyond you, you know what you call that? If it's only about you, it's not only narcissism, selfishness, and even hate. But if it's about those who transcend you, if you are not the reason, but because it's right, and it's for subsequent generations, what do you call it when you really do something for others? The word, and it connects to the revolutionary force of what you see in the entire black radical tradition, is a word that may sound corny, but it's true. The word is love. There's a difference in political work connected to love because its purpose is to make grow, to make happen that which is absent. Love and power in that sense works. Thank you.